up, roomies? Everyone has a part of themselves we rather not think about: anger, jealousy, fear, shame, and most of us spend our lives trying to hide those parts. But today's guest believes that that's exactly where we become our most powerful. Dr. Melissa Kim Corter is a deaf psychologist. Wait, excuse me. Dr. Melissa Kim Corter is a deaf psychologist, author, and an expert in Jungian shadow work. Did I pronounce that right? Because I feel like
Yep,
I
Jungian shadow. That's correct.
all right. Through psychology, mythology, fairy tales, and symbolisms of monsters, she helps people understand the hidden parts of themselves that often shape their lives without them realizing it. Today is not about becoming darker; it's about becoming whole. Welcome to In the House, Dr. Melissa Kim Corter.
Thank
What's
you
going
so
on,
much.
girl?
I'm so excited to be here with you. Thanks for taking on this topic because so many people are afraid to talk about these things, and it's my favorite thing to talk about. I could sit here with you for like 8 hours and get into some really cool territory.
Not believe me. Once you approached me about it, and I was just like, yes, automatically, because it's like everybody wants to talk about positive thinking, embracing the positive side of themselves, but nobody ever talks about going through their darkness and not only embracing it, but kind of like working through it and seeing why that topic is kind of dark for them in their own souls, and
Absolutely.
how like kind of neglecting that part of yourself kind of shapes you in a subconscious way that you're not realizing it. So
Absolutely.
once you approached me about it, I was all for it. I was just like, yes, let's make it happen, because it's a topic that a lot of people feel super uncomfortable talking about. And it takes a lot for a person to kind of like reach into themselves and say, you know what, I'm kind of messed up. And I'm using messed up very loosely. I don't mean that the
Sure.
person's messed up, but I'm kind of messed up because I have these kind of dark thoughts, or this trauma is affecting me, and I feel like I'm a negative person because of that. And a lot of people don't like working through that shadow.
That's true. There's so much. I feel like there's so many misconceptions about it. There's fear, there's
Yeah.
uncertainty and discomfort, but then we also receive a lot of negative messages and conditioning in society around these things. We're made to feel like they don't happen. And if they
Yeah.
do, we're not allowed to talk about it. We're certainly not like explore it. And I think honestly, that's what keeps people unwell is when they don't have places, safe people to really look a little bit closer into these things. Because what I found in the work that I do is that these forbidden places within us are filled with so much potential, and it's often less frightening than what people think, even though
Yeah.
the imagery and intrusive thoughts or nightmares, compulsions, all of these like scary sounding terms are nothing more than just code for there's something deeper going on trying to get our attention.
No, that's a big fact, because if you think about, if we just take storytelling and art, right, for instance, we notice that we're always attracted to some of the more darker imagery, like very
Sure.
gothic imagery. We find it beautiful, and it's not just because of the fact that is depicting something, I would say, darker, but is depicting a truth within it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is depicting a pain, is depicting a trauma that we kind of resonate with. And human psychology, I've noticed, we kind of tend to lean toward the dark side of things, but we always want to say, hey, yeah, think positively, and all this other light stuff, without addressing the fact that, what, there's some darkness in us that we resonate to because of the fact that we're still working through that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things too that I absolutely love about this work is there's also a kind of work with shadow and darkness where it has its own intelligence within it.
Yeah.
And so when I approach it that way, it's also finding the beauty in it. And when we can do that, we discover it's not all negative or scary or frightening. And so there's some types of darkness that are absolutely beautiful. Like I give the example of if you've ever had that moment, you can be sitting outside underneath the stars, or even just late at night next to a window or something, and the house is silent, everybody's asleep. and you just have this sort of overwhelming peacefulness that just passes through your body, maybe through your heart. So there are forms of darkness that are very safe and nurturing and warm. And so I like to kind of present that too, so that people don't feel that darkness only means all the things we don't like or the traumas
Yeah.
and the dramas. And of course, for sure, that's a piece of it, but also that this is our wholeness. So I love how you explain how we're drawn to certain movies or gothic, imagery, because it does have this really beautiful dark quality. And I think what's really special about those things, whether it's movies, artwork, whatever it might be, is it's not hiding from some of the difficult realities of life. We don't have to live in our suffering, but we want to also know that it exists and that we can become closer to one another, more compassionate by supporting each other through that suffering when we do experience it. So I feel like those things give us an outlet or an opportunity to find our own experience, to validate it and say, this is real, this occurred, or this happened to me. Where most of society seems to kind of want to turn a blind eye and act like it's not there.
No, that is true. And, correct me if I'm wrong, not all darkness is, like you said, rooted in trauma or,
Right.
something evil. But
Right.
you could find very, very, how can I say, you can find traits within yourself in your darkness, like for instance, courage or bravery, where you thought it
Yes.
was a violent tendency, but it was just, you just holding yourself back and thinking it was dark. But really, that was the key to, like, getting some courage in you, some bravery in you, for you to proceed forward.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you actually gave that as an example. So, just for listeners, a little bit of context maybe.
Yeah.
Jungian psychology is a unique form of psychology where not all the different types of theories and philosophies regarding psychology value this hidden part of us, right? This
Yeah.
part of our consciousness that is beneath our awareness. And Jungian psychology does. It embraces this whole other side to us that is not known. We can't really find it or source it. We can't point to it and say, oh, there it is, because we can't see it, but we have
Yeah.
access to it. And the way that we know it exists is through a reaction, through an emotion, a sensation. We know there are things that activate us, for better, for worse,
Yeah.
because of how it feels, right? The sensations, or if you've ever been in a moment with someone and you feel yourself kind of getting worked up, and your head is saying, why am I so bothered by what they're saying or what they're doing? Maybe there's no logic or no logical reason to why I should feel so triggered by this, but something in me is reacting. That part of us is in shadow, we would call it. We would say it's in the unconscious, it's beneath our awareness. And so, speaking to what you're saying, I wholeheartedly agree. So, a big part of Jungian psychology is that the shadow is not about negativity. Think of it more as a container holding things for us that we're ready to kind of explore. And we have, like, this is a little deeper dive into it, but I think it's helpful for people to understand. We have this part of us called an ego. It catches a terrible reputation for being a disaster, a part of us that's negative or it's bad. And that's true. We can have problematic egos. We can be really full of ourselves. We can be a little bit too concerned with our own needs and not other people. But there's a really essential function that the ego has that's speaking to all of this. And that is, it's a gatekeeper. So the ego is a complex that sits within the psyche. You can't see it. So it's more of an emotional construct that exists within us. But its entire job is to filter information. What we know has sort of been the information that comes up from the shadow, from the unconscious, and it becomes known because the ego recognizes it. That's when we have an idea, a thought, a belief. It means that this material that was within us became known. So the job of the ego, one of its many jobs, I should say, is to be that middle ground between what we know and what we don't know, and it filters that information. So the shadow itself sits beneath all of that, and then the ego lets some of that information pass through to us into our awareness. So when we think of this, this is why the shadow will hold certain qualities or traits that we haven't realized yet. So, in using your example, if we want to be more courageous, it exists. It's in shadow. All that means is we haven't practiced it enough. We haven't made it as clear in our daily actions. We're not giving ourselves the opportunity to work with that part of us more and more to make it feel like part of the larger part of our personality. So it's all there. It's just that it's in shadow. And so the ego is the part that we work with that allows more and more of those kind of things to come through. And it's just like exercise or anything else. The more that you work with some of these intentions that you have for whether it's a talent, a skill, something else, the more real it becomes. The more the ego will say yes to that and make it part of your dominant personality. So it takes work. And a lot of us just we're not taught these things, right? So we don't even know the basic functioning of our own psyches to say, oh, that quality that I see in other people that I admire, I have that too. I'm just not as well versed at accessing it and making it real and applying it every day. But when we can start to go, I know it exists because if I can see it in someone else, it exists in me too, we can start to work with it. So I love how you just kind of went right into, the qualities and the things that are in shadow that we're not even realizing that are there. They're also very positive for sure.
So in your opinion, right? What do you think, why do you think people don't want to kind of like explore their own shadow and kind of like go through their container?
That's such a great question. I think it's a very unique. I would say I would answer that based on the person, right? Everyone has a different reason for that. Some people, there can be different events, different. Sometimes when I describe trauma, I'll say impactful moments, because I think a lot of people can resonate with that and say, well, maybe I don't know if I've had a trauma or a traumatic experience, but I certainly can look back in my past and say there were things that impacted me deeply on some level. And sometimes that's the answer. Sometimes it's just this thing has happened. I'm afraid to revisit that again in my mind. Maybe I don't feel safe enough. Maybe I don't know where to begin. And I think also values play a role in this, where if we grow up in a family environment or a neighborhood or community that really acknowledges introspection, reflection, personal development, getting to know ourselves, having more open, honest conversations, we might feel more adventurous and kind of exploring the shadow. But a lot of times, just in what I've also been on the receiving end of, not even just as an expert talking about these things, right? But it's just as a human being on this planet, it's not always welcome in a lot of spaces. There's a lot of misconception because it's unknown, because it's kind of ominous. Especially in the United States, I know everyone is very different, so I'm not trying to speak on behalf of every society or culture or anything.
No, you're good. You're good.
But most of us kind of are like, have this weird relationship with the unknown. We're not taught how to trust in ourselves that we'll get through really difficult things. We cling to things. We end up with addictions, afflictions, default behaviors, all these things that will keep us from exploring ourselves. We're taught to medicate our pain away, whether it's physical or emotional. And by the way, when I say that, I'm not anti-medicine. I love medicine. I think it's a part of our support. And if we were also encouraged and taught to use those things along with our introspective, lens to say, I wonder what's going on here. I wonder what this feeling is telling me. I wonder what this really uncomfortable pattern is trying to say. Because the other thing that I kind of consider myself more of an expert in, before I would have labeled it shadow work, but today I recognize I can see the things in people they can't see within themselves. because we have these blind spots. So that's
Yeah.
another reason we might be afraid to explore. And the truth is, I think sometimes we can feel shame or
Yeah.
embarrassment to say, I've got this pattern or this problem. I feel like I'm smart. I feel like I'm emotionally intelligent. I feel like I should know better, right? Those are the kind of things we might find ourselves saying, which could then actually make us feel worse. So we don't want to address it or talk to someone about it. And the last thing we want to do is, already feeling kind of vulnerable on some level. It's hard to admit those things, let alone ask for help or find someone who is not going to judge us, but instead go, you're feeling that terrible thing. Oh my gosh, congratulations. You know why? That means you're somewhat in touch with your body or the symptom or something else. And you're actually so much farther along than you think you are to discovering what the body is trying to tell you. But those are the kind of things I think a lot of us learn by being seekers, because we're not
Yeah.
always given this kind of language or understanding of our own psyches and bodies and how it's all connected. And that symptoms of any kind really are some type of communication. And I think there's a lot of reasons we fear that, or create reasons not to explore it further. And sometimes it's
No,
people telling us we're not allowed to, or we shouldn't as well.
no, I get that because growing up in a predominantly in a Hispanic household, sometimes they're told to be seen and not heard. You know what I
Yes,
mean?
that's a great
So
example.
going based off of that example, like somebody could be told be seen, not don't be heard. That could like kind of later in life that could kind of like lead to them not speaking out on what they feel is right, or going for certain things that their heart wants to do, but that negative reinforcement kind of shuns them away from it. You know what I mean? And that trait is like kind of like latent in their shadow, I would say.
Absolutely. Yes, you nailed it. That's a really great way to articulate that. I think that that's example of how we can have a familial, environment, a family environment where um, there's just not the environment that's conducive to that type of growth. And I'm always kind of delicate when I say that, because it doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying something against parents or loved ones.
Yeah,
People, I really want to believe for the most part we're doing the best we can.
true.
And within that, though, there's always reactions and results to what's known, what's handed down. So there is an ancestral component to the shadow and how we work with that. And absolutely, so that sort of conditioning or that family environment we grow up in, the being seen and not heard, is actually a very specific set of patterns. And so communication, how we express ourselves. What's interesting about that is some people who have had that similar kind of thing. I mean, look, now here you are with this
Yeah.
podcast, right? Using your voice to express. I
Yeah.
love how creative our psyches really are, and giving us maybe what we didn't have at a younger age. Right? We find it
Yeah.
later in some way if we're really trusting ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to seek that out, and sometimes it just finds us. But definitely, there's sort of like these family patterns and dynamics, and not being seen, and or not being heard, or both, it can feel that way, is a specific set of patterns too, where we then might have to go through a journey in our life of sort of reclaiming that for ourselves, or deciding, I understand how I grew up, I'm aware of these things. If I have to forgive someone, I forgive someone, or work on that, or myself, or whoever, whatever. But then in addition to that, it's like, okay, maybe I wasn't able to express at that time. How would I consciously choose to do that today? And sometimes that might require us to pretend, sounds kind of funny, but to pretend like, well, what would my teenage self say if it had the microphone, or if it had the pen right in the journal or something else? What would that sound like? What could I say today as the adult who's taking charge of my well-being? What would I want to give my younger self permission to say? And those kind of techniques, I've seen it change people's lives. The mind wants to tell us
Yeah.
it's kind of dumb, maybe silly. Why would we even do that kind of a thing? But the truth is, we have these invisible sort of parameters, rules for who we can be, how we can do it, how much we can show up, how much we can receive, how much we're allowed to take, how much we're allowed to whatever, fill in the blank. And
Yeah.
so when we start to kind of challenge those beliefs, is when we're actually doing shadow work in a different way. We're saying, well, I don't know. Maybe there's more to what I know about this. Maybe I haven't been capable of doing that thing up until this point. But what if I decided that that thing I want to go after or I want to become is just as possible? And then we start to break down the beliefs around the idea of who we think we are and who the family said we are. And sometimes there's more there because obviously we didn't all grow up in the same household. There's different
Yeah.
levels of trauma, of impact, of really deep-seated issues that happen in all of our different households. And so we might have to work really hard for confidence, to belong, to find appreciation, to feel loved. And you can also have grown up in a perfectly normal household and still struggle with those things and still have to do that kind of work. But the point is that it's available to us. And I think that's one of the most amazing things when we start to kind of dive in a little bit and go, wait a minute, this doesn't mean I have to act like nothing ever happened to me or that I have to just stop telling my story. But maybe if I can tell the story of what happened, I also can acknowledge of what the story looks like going forward that can be different for me. And that sometimes can be really healing for people.
I get that. And and this is a question that popped in my head when you were right now is, can people, all right, I know that in life you have to have a balance between, your conscious self and I guess your shadow self.
Sure.
When people find that balance, do they find like traits or, strengths within themselves that they're like, holy shit, this is the person I always was, and I was just like suppressing this part of myself?
Yes, I'm a complete example of that. I myself am a complete example of that. The work I do now is not something I ever thought I would do. I never in a million years thought I would be talking about ghosts and nightmares and this all these darker perceived things so publicly and through a lens of psychology and creativity. I wanted nothing to do with any of this stuff. I actually thought when I was younger, I wanted to be like work with the FBI and be like Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs. I was going to be like a
Yeah.
criminal profiler or something, But I also, at a really young age, felt so judged and criticized for being the weird kid. I was so strange. I would like play detective when I was really little and like dig in the backyard looking for like dead bodies and thinking I was going to solve a crime. And, I always had this kind of very curious, weird rescue warrior-ish kind of thing going on when I was younger. But I also played alone a lot because I had a
Yeah.
rich imagination. I felt deeply misunderstood. I felt like I didn't belong in this world. I also grew up in a household that was really complicated. There was a lot of avoidance of emotion on one hand, where completely just checked out, not engaged, not emotional whatsoever. And then another, the other parent essentially drowning in emotion, overwhelmed
Yeah.
to the point where it was just catastrophic. And so my safe place was the woods. And that always, spending that time outdoors, what it did to me is it made me really deeply attuned to nature and to
Yeah.
people's emotions, their emotional states. So at a really young age, I had a very strong intuition. I just knew things. I sensed things. I felt things. Now I understand it's part of the confusion of being hypervigilant and growing up in that type of
Yeah.
house. But anyhow, the point of me sharing that is I went through a big chunk of my life where I also tried to shut it all down, tried to act
Yeah.
like none of it was happening, tried to lose myself in drugs and alcohol and terrible situations and all of that. And people around me were just dying left and right in tragic,
Yeah.
tragic ways. And I went through this really long phase of that, from just avoiding who I was, the person who just had a fascination with the darker parts of life. When I was really young, I was interested in serial killers, not glorifying crime, not being like, oh my gosh, they're so cool. More so, I was like, what drives human behavior? What causes someone to go off the rails? Why would one person hurt another person? Now I understand that I also was such a deep feeling person. I had so much empathy for people, and also I had so much pain at the
Yeah.
same time, that I sought out abnormal psychology to feel safe. It was like my way of feeling safe in the world, because at a young age I knew the world wasn't safe, or had made that decision, because there was a lot of strange things that happened around my hometown where I grew up. There were a couple serial killers. There was some strange, very in the media kind of like big time stories that happened all in a very short proximity to my household. My house was also on one of the most haunted roads in the entire country. They actually made a movie
Yeah.
about it. And so I grew up in this house as this really sensitive kid, having unique, weird experiences. And then people were afraid of me because of it. So I
Yeah.
shut all that down. And it wasn't until decades later that I got into the more personal development, wellness, spiritual kind of environments.
Yeah.
And what's funny about that, which kind of ties into this whole thing here, is I thought, well, these are all spiritual people. They talk about love and light. They're talking about frequency and vibration, and they don't deal with darkness, and they want no part of that. And all of a sudden, I start realizing I'm seeing these patterns and sensing these patterns in people, and it's still darkness. It's hiding in light. It is using
Yeah.
light, exploiting these behaviors to carry out these terrible things. And I thought, isn't that interesting that what they seem to be afraid of is actually hiding in plain sight through people and situations that were exploiting vulnerable people, kind of like cult like mentality, or
Yeah.
gurus, or people that were just preying on vulnerable people. And I thought, isn't that strange that these people are drawn to this because they want to heal, they want to be better, they feel broken, or they feel disconnected, and they're leading themselves right to the very thing that's going to exploit that. And so I started to come home to myself and go, what would happen if you would embrace this? Now I'm describing this very logically. It was not logic. There was a series of crazy things, but just to get to the point,
No, I get you. I get you. Don't worry about it.
right? It's like, it was a shit show, to be honest with you. But eventually what happened is I just went, I wonder if I just stop suppressing this part of me, what would happen? I wonder if I stop hiding the fact that I study criminal behavior and I'm interested in forensics and I love nature and I can help people with nightmares and compulsions and the darkest parts of them. Like, what would happen if I just stopped fighting that part of myself? And bam, everything came together. Everything came together. I started publishing in a more public way, let's just say, started getting more attention in my business and the things. And I had been trying for years to make a go of my work. And it wasn't until I actually acknowledged, this is my bizarre, weird superpower, is seeing the things in people that they can't see, showing them their blind spots, and showing people how we don't all have to study terrible things to find value in darkness. But those of us that do are not dark because of it. We actually are some of the safest people. We just have an ability that allows us to be very discerning and observant, so that we're not taking those things on, but instead truth tellers. It's like journalists, artists, writers, painters, musicians, people that tackle the shadow in their work and they don't hide from it. And I think that's why we love those things so much, because we feel the soulfulness in it, which again is showing that there's an invisible intelligence there. There's a soulful part of darkness. And so this idea of evil, I like to kind of challenge it and say, what if that's just our projections? Because when you
True.
start pulling back those projections and become really honest, you'll notice yourself saying things like, that just makes me really uncomfortable and I don't have another word for it. Or
That's
that situation make me so sad to think about. I don't have another word for it. Or that person did something I just can't fathom to another person. I don't even know what to do with that, right? Fill in the blank. We use evil to keep ourselves psychologically and emotionally distant from things that make us uncomfortable instead of embracing the fact that part of our reality is grappling with those things. And so I just accepted myself in that, the world in that, and now I actually see, sense, and feel more beauty in everything from accepting the darker shadow things. So it's also not like this one-sidedness where everything in my life is only about shadow, but I don't deny that, which makes the rest of my life more rich. So anyway, I just thought that was an example that kind of spoke to how do we, what do we do if we're denying or like this part of us? It's like, well, here's what can happen when you don't. Just you come alive in a different way.
No, I completely get you on that because it's not really about the darkness within yourself. It's basically putting two halves together. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes.
And this is the thing about it, like society, and excuse my French, society could be a motherfucker sometimes.
Absolutely. It
Where
is. Sure.
where we get to the point where we're super interested in something, and because of the fact that we go to school and other kids tease us, or our parents may not understand our interest, or generally the people around us think we're weird because of the fact that we may like X, Y, and Z. We kind of suppress that to try to fit into normality.
Yes.
And then when we get to a certain point in our life, we kind of get the picture that there's no such thing as normal.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Because everything has its place. A person like yourself who, dove deeper into like darker psychology and stuff like that and wanted to deal with forensic, we need people like you to help people with get over trauma, not really trauma, but get over like certain things that are blocking them and help them find that wholeness. Or even when you go into forensics, you need somebody who's going to be interested in like a body decaying and how the person ended up this way. And even though it's a gruesome, yet again, violence is never the answer, and we're facing these gruesome scenes every day. Their brains are fascinated of how that occurred. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And society, at least what I think, society kind of like suppresses people from kind of diving into their true interest because everybody wants to be quote unquote normal or be a part of the status quo, I would say.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. And I think that is like when we look back on things, at least myself personally, when I look at
Yeah.
the people that I'm drawn to that inspire me are so weird, are so awesome and weird. And I'm
Yeah.
kind of like, wow, if they just chose the simple path of I'm going to blend in, I'm not going to challenge things, I'm going to yes myself to death with this or that and act a certain way so I don't stand out, I never would have found their work. I maybe their artwork or their music or and the thing about that is like we all get to choose, right? So I love your example because something I actually did a couple year last year, well, 2025, something I did early in the year. I
Yeah.
actually went through a death investigator training, and it was a really difficult certification process.
I
And
believe
the
it.
death investigator works through the medical examiner's office. And so they have this weird sort of in between the medical examiner's office and law enforcement. That's like their middle ground. They're a part of the medical examiner's office and they are responsible for the body at a crime scene. So law enforcement is responsible for the crime, what happened, and who's involved. But the actual medical examiner's office with the death investigator is responsible for that body, the care of the body,
Yeah.
making sure evidence was collected, that they were treated with respect and
Yeah.
all of that. And I went through this training and it was really difficult. I had to watch some of the most horrific things I never would have thought that I would be subjected to. And no, I'm not going to go into those things, but
Yeah.
a lighter, not lighter, but a different example, I guess, would be even just to tell what a body looks like you said, through different stages of decay with different, if something is near the woods or in water or, these different stages. And I found it fascinating because I realized like the people that are willing to get closer to what is ugly or disturbing. And I mean, if we are coming from it very intentionally, not to glorify crime or anything like that, but if we're being very intentional and we have the capacity to do that work, you get to tell the truth about things. And what a sacred duty that is, right? To be someone that said, I'm not going to turn away from this horrible thing because this person deserves justice. They don't have a voice for themselves, right? Here's this body, the situation that can no longer communicate, cannot speak, but it can just differently through science and through gesture, different things, right? And so I thought that was a challenge of mine, is like, I didn't go down this profiler route. And there was a time with that, I wanted to be a forensic pathologist. And I learned very quickly I wouldn't be able to do that work. So I tried this, I went through this training instead, really for research and as a writer, to just have this experience. And it was one of the most rewarding and difficult things I've ever done. And I have so much respect for the people that do that work. That just what they see and encounter, the horrors of the world, and then they translate that, and then they make it, they offer the information so that actions can be taken. Because the other thing the death investigator has to do, that's such a wild thing, and when we think about this, their job is to notify next of kin. So think about that, right? That's an intense position to be in, to do that day in and day out, and to go through that training and to see how it's handled and how the clarity that's needed, the compassion that's needed, but also you have to be really willing to not sugarcoat anything and just be very direct and clear. There's so much that goes into those things, and having the opportunity to go through that training, not only did it kind of break my heart open in a good way to this whole other world, but it made me more committed to my path about telling the truth about difficult things. Because when I spent all that time, all those years ago, in the wellness and spiritual kind of environments, and by the way, I'm not against those things for people listening that are deeply connected to that. There's still a lot of amazing, wonderful things happening there. We just need discernment. But when I spent all of that time there, I really, it showed me that there's so many layers. There's so many layers to life, to personality, to contrast and conflict. And that we tend to focus on the positive things. And because of that, I always wondered, well, what do you do when you have someone now who's lost a child or who's gone through this, right, this situation? They don't really find the support in the love and light and just think positive and find the meaningful silver lining. I'm sorry, but there's no silver lining in certain things. And that's where I feel like some of this work is also helpful. It doesn't try to sugarcoat a really tragic event or situation, but instead you can find other ways to bring in support, to let the people know that they matter. Their story matters. What they went through matters on all fronts. So that's something else I'm really passionate about, is not glorifying crime at all, but looking at like these places where some of us have just not ever felt like we had a home in a certain industry or area because it wasn't wanted there. There's a lot of people in those certain industries that are healers, or they're helping, they're doing really great work in the world, and they get really uncomfortable if something is too much, too intense, too
Yeah.
tragic. And my thought on that is you don't have to work with everything. And at the same time, these people deserve a place to go, because they don't have a happy ending, right? Their situation went the way it went. And so, what can we do from there to support them so that they can learn how to be with this tragedy as they heal, as they move forward, instead of acting like it didn't happen or just throwing love and light at everything? It doesn't work. In fact, love and light, I'm not against it, but it's again about being very intentional and the idea of
Yeah.
wholeness. When we take concepts like love and light and manifestation and your thoughts create your reality and those kind of things, we might be inadvertently shaming people that are trying to figure out how to just get out of bed and grieve and go through a process. They can't go there. That feels like an insult
Yeah.
instead of some type of positive, helpful tool. So there's a big gap between working with like tragic circumstances and situations and positive affirmations and sort of
No, I
the,
get you.
you know what I mean? Like there's a
No,
weird
no,
gap.
I definitely do. I definitely do. And the thing about it is like, and this, I've spoken to mediums. I've spoken to people who do light work and all this other things, and the addressment of your dark side of the trauma, they always trying to promote positivity, light, different perspective. But the underlining thing that I've noticed is that no matter how you put it out there, there's one common theme, and that's that you have to work through it.
Mm.
No matter if it's dressed up as love and light, or you're grieving, you have to work through it. And when you're able to be more comfortable addressing the darkness and a not so pretty, loving, light situation, and you're able to address it and see it for what it is, you'll be able to work through that. I'm not saying that throw love and light and positive perspective at everything. No, if your parent, if your child died, if your parent died, if you witnessed war and all these other gruesome activities, these gruesome events that happen in people's lives, I'm not saying get up and smile. No.
Right.
but you do have to kind of address it so that way it doesn't like take apart from you,
Yeah.
or take a part of you away, I would say.
I love that. That's a great way to say that. What came to
Yeah.
mind as you were saying that is that there's ways to work through it where, something that I would offer is like sometimes it's too far of a stretch for us to reach for hope when we're kind of in that place of processing, right? Or moving
Yeah.
through it, whether it's grief or whether it's some other anger, rage, something else. Hope kind of feels like a joke or a slap in the face a little bit,
Yeah.
right? It kind of feel a little intense for people. So something that I've kind of really leaned into in these kind of conversations is the idea of relief. Sometimes relief is a little easier in that gap between those big feeling differences or contrast, right? Between
Yeah.
someone grieving and someone feeling gratitude or whatever it might be. Relief is a helpful thing, and that can come in so many forms. It can be somebody just listening to your story. It can be somebody saying, you don't have to figure this out right now. It could be someone just offering like, I'm really sorry that happened to you. So someone doesn't feel so alone. So relief is different because we're not trying to fix or soothe or escape the shadowy dynamics of things or the pain or the suffering or tragic, whatever it might be, even if it's not trauma based and even if it's not intense suffering or something of that nature. But even someone just going through a really difficult period of uncertainty, which can feel really dark too, relief is something that we can offer. And I had this experience one time that helped me see this differently. I love how intuition, when we really just pay attention to it, it can just open things up in the most incredible and simple, profound ways. So I
Yeah.
one day was scrolling and I came across this random article. It was talking about grief, and it was talking about what you can do for someone when they're grieving, because it's a weird thing, right? To kind of be like, well, do I just call them? Do I check in? Everybody wants to say, hey, I'm here if you need anything, but that's actually putting more burden of responsibility on that person, because now you're telling them, hey, reach out to me, when they just might be in a place where they can't think that way. So anyhow, I'm reading this article and it said something kind of unique that stood out to me, and that was
Yeah.
maybe just send them some groceries. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I can't tell you why, but I just felt this overwhelming, like, save that article. So I did. And sure enough, it was 2 weeks later, I had talked to a relative. They had called and told me that another one of my relatives had passed away. And I was
Yeah.
shocked. It was like a shocking situation. They were young. It was one of those, like, wow. And that article just popped right back in my mind. Because I kept asking, what can I do? How can I help? And the answer, and I don't mean this in a judging way, like, I don't blame them. They just couldn't respond. It was just, I don't know, and it's okay, and I'll figure it out. And, thank you for the support. They couldn't really say, here's how you can help me. And I didn't know what to ask to be helpful, right? So I thought of that
Yeah.
article. And instead, I just reached out to a different one of our relatives and said, can you just make sure they're there? And the address, I'm just going to have some different things. Are they vegan? Are they this? Are they that? And they knew enough to give me that info. And I just sent over like a week's worth of groceries. I just thought of random stuff, when you don't want to think, you don't want to go to the store, what maybe do you need? And we just kind of picked some different things from their local store and had it delivered. And it was something that it didn't take me very much time or money. And the impact that gesture had was shocking. Like, they were so overwhelmed with gratitude. They didn't have to get in the car and go to the store while they're a mess and crying and disoriented, and you can't think, and you can't, where to clean up things and do like basic human things we don't always think about. But I saved that article because something in me was like, pay attention to this. And I think that the reason I pay attention is because I acknowledge those positive, interesting, intuitive things, but I also acknowledge those other types of intuitive things that are like, something's off here. Don't trust
Yeah.
that, and I think sometimes we want to always give people the benefit of the doubt, and we got to find that middle ground that's discerning, that says, I'm not going to walk around this planet in fear that it is a terrible place or anything of that nature, but I'm going to remember that the only thing for me that I can really trust is patterns are predictable, and patterns of behavior will continue, for better or for worse, until they're interrupted. So I'm going to pay attention to the pattern of the person, which helps me be more detached from the personality they're presenting. And that's usually when my intuition will say, yeah, you can trust that, or that feels right, or yeah, there's resonance there. That person's really congruent with who they are and how they feel, or well, there's something off there. I'm going to trust my instincts on this. And again, you don't have to like walk around in fear, but when you have that kind of discernment, your intuition will show you all the layers of different things with people. And so when we are kind of like hardwired to only look for the good, we're going to see more good, but we might miss some things that are just red flags, and then feel a little bit blindsided by that. So part of this work is also cultivating discernment so that we feel just a little more equipped within ourselves, to recognize that the shadow is in each one of us, and we're all vulnerable to that. And that's not a negative or scary thing. It just means that if we're really anchored into who we are, we'll pick up on some of these patterns, and that in its own way will help us navigate how to handle them when these situations come up. And that's such an empowering feeling, to trust yourself so deeply, because you've stopped thinking that people are all good or all bad, or always manipulative, or always something else. And just to remember, there's layers there. So that's kind of helped me as well to kind of see things through that lens, if it's both, always, and trust the pattern. Because when you see it, just remember that people, we all have blind spots. There's this little secret trick that they give us in when I was going through training, and they would talk about how you are going to be blind to some of your greatest patterns, but somebody you barely know that you've had a few conversations with will be able to spot a few things because they're not living in it. It's the same way we can watch a celebrity on television and go, oh my gosh, why did they do that again? Like, I saw that terrible relationship coming from a mile away. Like, we're kind of some kind of expert on their lives, right? Getting in their business.
Yeah.
But there's some truth in that, where it's like, yeah, same, different face, same energy, same problematic pattern. And so we all have these blind spots. And so sometimes when people are being manipulative or we're experiencing deception or something of that kind, there can be a blind spot there. So you are the best expert in that moment on what you're feeling, because they don't always know what they're projecting, or they don't always know how they're coming across. So I think that's helpful for those of us that are also learning how to trust ourselves again, or to go, but I've been fooled, or how did I not know? And here's the thing about that. You can be fooled by a pattern or someone's behavior, but that doesn't make you foolish. You just keep learning and trying to understand. It takes time to become sensitive to those things when we've kind of had our blinders on for a long time. So, but you can do it. You can trust yourself, and you can walk through this world with more confidence that you can work with your shadow, and that you don't have to fear it. And you start to see things more clearly. It's really a beautiful way, I think, to navigate this messy world sometimes.
No, I get you. And just going back to like when a person's grieving, right? And the gift of groceries, right? I think that gesture is 1,000 times better than, if you need anything, reach out to me, because you're giving that person a responsibility now to look for you when they're down and out. But if you just give them the basic needs, I know you're going through stuff, make sure you're eating. Here's groceries. It's kind of saying that I understand that you're not in the best place right now. And I know that you may not be able to speak or articulate exactly how you need me to help, but here, make sure you're eating, because I want to make sure you're okay. And that shows love, and that shows, that I truly do care for you.
That's right. Absolutely. Right. I mean? And staples, right? It doesn't have to be like, their diet inside and out. It can just be like milk, eggs, box of cereal, like maybe some chicken, whatever, just a couple of things that feel, like you said, it's like care. You're just showing that you care, and make it
some ice cream, comfort food and all that
comfort
stuff.
Food, pasta. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
But can somebody become dangerous simply because they spent their whole life like suppressing who they really are?
Absolutely. Yeah, they can, for sure. Because what happens, and there's no like cookie cutter approach. So there's some clues or indicators or things we could definitely say, okay, that's problematic. What happens is the more we push something down, it doesn't go away. And it can become dangerous in a lot of ways. It can become dangerous where it comes out, we lash out on someone else because something triggers us. And it just is like trying to keep this enormous ball of fire beneath the surface, and it just erupts. We see it all the time with road rage or these situations that look, people will say senseless act. And I challenge that now, because I'm like, it's only senseless to the observer. But most people really believe, whether they're conscious of it or not, that whatever their action was about, that there were things that led up to that. We just may not know what they are. But people can absolutely become extremely dangerous from suppressing who they are. I think a great example of this, I'm not going to go into super detail of this person's crimes, but Jeffrey Dahmer is an example of that. I've studied him extensively, and actually wrote part of my dissertation for my doctoral studies was on his personality. And he suppressed a large part of who he was, and it came out in some of the most horrific and problematic ways. Just terrible, absolutely terrible. But here's another interesting way to say that. Sometimes it's not outwardly projected, but internally. So we call that introjection. So we might suppress
Yeah.
who we are to the point where we make ourselves ill. We become self destructive. So
Mhm.
some people internalize, and that suppression will come out in symptoms through the physical body that are killing them, right? It doesn't have to be someone actually physically going through the act of causing harm to someone else. It can be the suppression and how it's eating away at the body, how it's manifesting in different ways because it's not being acknowledged. So the ego is the part of us that's pushing that information down. So this is important, I think, just as a little side note, right? So
Yeah.
when we consciously push information down, that's suppression. That's when we kind of know, I don't want to feel this, I don't want to deal with it, and we push it down. There's a natural function of the ego, um, and it's a beautiful safety mechanism that we all have, where we unconsciously push information down, and that's repression. We're not thinking about it, we don't even know what's happening, it just happens. And this is where you might have moments, memories, trauma, things that were too much, that the psyche just decides to push down into the unconscious, into shadow. And that too can come out through the body, through nightmares, through different compulsions and things of that nature. But that's an unconscious process that a lot of us
Mhm.
will experience at some point in our lives. And it's also it can be very dangerous. And then oppression is we've been talking about that a little bit here and there. That's
Yeah.
when we get it from the outer world. That's when
Yeah.
a family, a culture, a government, a society, a neighborhood, whatever, um, tells us who we are, what we can and can't do, tries to control, manipulate from the outside. That's oppression. And all of those things are dangerous for different reasons and lead to a host of different types of things. And the symptoms range. Again, there's
Mhm.
physical symptoms we might feel. Sometimes it's a serious health issue, an autoimmune cancer, all different types of things. Other times it's violent actions out into the world. But what I've also noticed is that sometimes that suppression or, repression, either way, of who we are can also be why we're having the nightmares, the compulsions, the intrusive thoughts. It's the psyche's way of trying to give us impressions to tell a story about something that we've decided we don't want to know, we don't want to talk about, we don't want to hear or discuss or see any further. And so we
Yeah.
work really hard. And those are the ego defenses. So we all have ego defenses, like denial, we probably heard
Yeah.
of, or compartmentalization. Sublimation is a healthy way of taking what's been pushed down and channeling it into something else. So if you have rage and you decided to learn kickboxing, that's sublimation. You're
Yeah.
taking all that anger, but you're doing something with it. So that's actually a healthy ego defense. But yeah, we all have these different things. And the more conscious we become of what's going on within us, the better we treat ourselves, the better we treat others in society. And then we also have more compassion to say, okay, you know what, this person I'm labeling monster or evil, I think is just deeply disconnected and misguided. And we start to kind of have a different type of capacity to look into those things a little more and see that there's other things going on beneath the surface.
I get that. And Dr. Melissa, today has been an eye opener, and this is fascinating. I swear to everything. And I thank you for being on. But before I let you go, I do have one question that I ask all my guests.
Sure.
And do you have any words of wisdom, advice, or final thoughts for the roomies?
Oh, you know, um, I promise you that whatever you're going through, whatever you're experiencing, it's never too dark or too difficult to explore, and you're not alone. I think people need to hear that they're not alone.
Yeah.
I think isolation and things like that can make us feel separate from one another, and then we go into shame. Um, and yeah, just a reminder, like, you're never alone, and get the help or reach out or find a safe person. And if you don't have one, it's not because they don't exist. You just might have to go outside of your community or outside of your network to find someone that can sit with you and listen to you share your story. There's a beautiful quote by Carl Jung about his definition of evil. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something along the lines of believing that evil is a result of people not being able to tell their stories. And I think that's really fascinating to kind of think about or consider. And so we all have a story or multiple things we've gone through, and we deserve to be able to find the people or the person that can listen and be a mirror for us or acknowledge what it is that's there. So if you're struggling, just reach out. I hope that there was something in our conversation today that struck a chord. And just keep trusting, following your instincts, and just little by little chipping away at the fears or the misconceptions that you're not allowed to explore your being. There's so much more for you to discover in this world and in your own psyche. So thank you very much for having me today.
Anytime, Dr. Melissa. And roomies, remember, explore your dark side, because it might lead you to become more whole with yourself and more happy with yourself. Because darkness doesn't really equate to evil, as we learned today. And with that, peace out.